Alright, hello and welcome. This is CT5, and today we'll be talking about dice in video games. Dice! So we'll look at three games and sort of compare and notice how they use dice, what they care about, what they're trying to do with the dice. But first, let's get to understand how dice work in the real world. And let's just start with this. The first obvious thing to note about dice is that, they have this physical form. And so with this physical form, we can see it, we can feel it, we can hear it. And that's actually part of the die rolling experience. So dice do two big things, right? One, they're a driver of randomness and sort of like the mechanics of the game. But they're also a huge driver of emotions and the overall experience. And so I suspect that when you hear the rattle of the dice, there's might be a part of you that gets drawn in a little bit, that wants to care about what's going on. And if I were to even roll it, some of y'all might be curious to find out what I actually rolled. So it's really interesting that, as a driver of emotions, that we as humans and players, have a very natural, intuitive sense that we understand that dice helps us build anticipation and excitement of the moment. And right, a lot of our behaviors around dice sort of emphasize this fact that our feelings around dice and how much we care about it trumps whatever all sorts of rationality, right? We fully understand that die rolls are independent of each other and that our behaviors regarding dice, olden American times, people would blow on dice for good luck. Apparently, you see that every now and then. Or maybe you've had the experience of on a more important roll, you will roll extra long or extra vigorously, right? We understand that all these various behaviors and superstitions around dice don't influence the outcome, but we do it anyway. We care. So now that we understand the function of dice, we can start to talk about in the sense of video games. And the first thing to notice is that it's really weird to incorporate dice into a video game, right? It's a sort of very unnatural feeling to sort of insert this sort of out-of-game object to then have influence on the game world. And the whole point of video games and having this virtual world is that you don't need any of that. And you can keep the randomness in the background so that the player's immersion of the experience doesn't get broken. But dice can still be useful to include as a driver of emotions and excitement. The aspects of dice that are worth translating and adding to a video game are the ones that draw the player in and build anticipation and engagement, and that improve the overall experience. So the three games we'll be looking at are, no one's surprised, Baldur's Gate 3 and Solasta, Crown of the Magister. So these two are the very obvious games to compare because they both use Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as the core set of rules. So we'll first look at their combat, at how they choose to use dice in combat. And then after that, we'll start to look at how they use dice for skill checks. And this is where we can add our third game, Disco Elysium, because this game also features skill checks. And for definitions, skill check is essentially some sort of moment or event or situation in game where if you have the appropriate skill, it will increase the likelihoods of a favorable result. Alright, so starting off with looking at the combat, we'll start with Solasta. And what's interesting about Solasta is that you see every single roll. I'm not as familiar with Solasta, but at the very least, you see every single attack roll. So whether the attack hits or misses, as well as the damage roll associated. You see every single one. And boy, is it disappointing to see the misses happen because dice, you're gonna miss. And even worse for a disappointing damage roll, especially for on a critical hit. Oof. Anyways. So one thing that's worth noting, right? We talked about how important the physical representation, the actual physical experience of dice is very important for the overall die rolling experience. And notice how Solasta preserves this. If you look at the bottom there, you might not hear it. So there's a sound effect that signifies rolling. We see a little bit of motion as the dice sort of turn. And then we see the actual result. And one thing that I think Solasta did really well is that, so the obvious part, they display it in a very sort of informative but non-intrusive manner. And more importantly, I like that they sync up the die rolls with the animation of the character. So you see the attack hit or miss basically around the same time as the dice finish rolling. So you see it, you see the visual confirmation in game, and then you can just quickly glance down at the bottom to see the actual die results if you really care about the mechanical breakdown. One thing that is nice about the way they do it in Solasta versus the actual roll, so or in like physical D&D. So when you're playing in tabletop, right, you first make one roll to see if the attack hits or not, and then you roll the dice to see the damage. Typically, right? I imagine groups can do these differently, but there's an interesting build up an expectation here, especially if we go back to the critical hit example. So when you first roll to see if you hit or not, you know if it's going to be a critical hit or not. So if you do land that, that nat 20, you see a crit, you're getting a huge, big anticipation of the awesomeness of the following damage roll. So in critical hit, you essentially double the number of dice you have to roll. And what happens if you happen to roll terribly on that crit when you just see 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2? Awful. Awful, awful, awful. Like, worst feeling ever. It's something I really don't like. And in terms of like psychology and like behavioral reinforcement, like the larger the mismatch between your expectation, your mental expectation, and then the actual results is a big determinant of like whether behavior is like reinforced or not. And right, so and this is what I mean by it feels really, really bad, because you're expecting it here, and then when you roll terribly and the actual result is down here, it feels awful. Awful, awful, awful. And whether like the high highs make up for the low lows has yet to be seen. Okay, so that's how Solasta does combat. Yeah, let's look at how Baldur's Gate 3 does combat. So Baldur's Gate 3 embraces the fact that this is a video game and leaves all the combat dice rolls in the background. But in terms of like attack rolls and damage rolls, you don't see dice anywhere. So it just preserves that video game feel. It does not bother to include the dice there at all. Where Baldur's Gate 3 does choose to use the dice are for those skill checks I was talking about earlier. So in dialogue especially, and in exploration. And in dialogue options where you need to make a roll, Baldur's Gate 3 makes the die roll front and center. It's essentially like an overlay, and sort of everything pauses in anticipation of the die roll. The die roll is right there in the middle. You see whatever little bonuses you get, and then you click the dice and you watch it roll. It kind of feels like it's like you're rolling a physical die. Look at it go. And then you get the result, and then it does the math for you, and like it feels good. Like it really, 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 really emphasizes how important the roll feels in the moment, and it does a very good job of building up that anticipation of the roll. Right? If we look at all the things, like if there's a roll we care about, it keeps that sort of heightened suspense that we can simulate, that we get in the real world just from. So I think that was really cool. I think another nice thing Baldur's Gate 3 does is that while exploring, and maybe your character might notice something. It might notice a trap. It might notice like a interesting hidden little object or something. It's just a very subtle. It's just a nice little indicator. Like you don't see the actual mechanic. You don't actually see the numbers. You don't see the big die roll as you see here. It's just a small thing that pops up over your character's head. It just lets you know whether they succeed or failed on their skill check. And what I like is that it also preserves a feeling from tabletop, physical D&D, in that, right, every now and then your GM will say, hey, like everyone roll, or like you make a roll. And it's a fun little signal that maybe there's something afoot, maybe there's something going on, and it's worth paying attention to. It gets people's interest, it brings people together, it draws people in. And I like that you get to keep that. Like if you see the little, perception successful or failed or whatever, then you're like, oh, what's going on? Where is it? And again, without being necessarily very intrusive or needing to like necessarily pause the game. So Solasta, again, less familiar with, but for better or worse. So Solasta obviously has these die rolls and skill checks and dialogue as well, and probably exploration as well. For better or worse, Solasta keeps the die rolls in that same sort of informative but unintrusive manner towards the bottom of the screen. So combat, dialogue, whatever. Whenever you see a die roll, it's always going to be in that same spot. Which again, has ups and downs. Consistency and the informativeness, very, very good. but it doesn't really make any of the rolls feel necessarily special or more important. Now, having said that, let's go look at Disco Elysium, which is just a very, very, very different game. So, I think the way they use dice in Disco Elysium is pretty fascinating. And so, the first thing to note is that the dice and the die rolls are, generally speaking, invisible. A lot of the rolls happen in the background, and in fact, fully so for your internal monologue. So what's going on in Disco Elysium is, what makes this game so cool is, it tries to capture the feeling of the human body and the human brain in action, right? It tries to capture, it gives voice to all your senses and your thoughts and your interpretations. It's this rich, rich, rich internal monologue from the brain and body all working together. And so what's neat is that a lot of the roles happen in the background, just like, much like how our brain is sort of always internally calculating and processing stuff, even when we're not fully aware of it. It's kind of meant to give that feeling. And a lot of our sort of like ordinary thoughts that happen, I feel, are represented by these sort of invisible background roles. When you do see dice in Disco Elysium, it's for a skill check. And what's interesting here, there's always the same audio cue for when a die roll happens for these skill checks. So you get an audio cue, and you see the final result, and so you only see the squares, i.e. the relevant faces, the relevant numbers for the result. And a cool personal note, the audio cue, it kind of has the feeling of like rusty machinery, which is very fitting given the state of the character in Disco Elysium. But anyways, yeah, so these skill checks, if we notice how the internal monologue, if we see it as just like your brain normally functioning as it goes, I believe the skill checks represent your brain actually sort of doing like active work, active thinking, or like physically interacting with the world. Indeed, like some of the skill checks in Disco Elysium have heightened suspense because all the UI game elements fade out of the background and we focus on your character doing a thing. And then based on the result, then you realize, oh no, he messed up, I messed up, this did not go well, or holy shit, it worked. And everything fades back in, you see the dice show up. And like you hear, as it fades out, you hear the die roll. So you get that same audio cue, you hear the die roll, you get the same sound effect for a result being decided, but you don't know what it is until you actually see it. So, having said all that, my sort of last concluding, ending thought and claim is that for these three games, where and how the developers use the dice sort of signals where they're placing their emphasis for the game. So, the way I interpret is that Solasta's goal is to make it feel like you're playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's the feel, to make sure that, to sort of be faithful and represent all the mechanics as it is. And as we mentioned, right, combat, you see every single roll. When you take a rest, there's another difference between Solasta and Baldur's Gate. In Solasta, when you take a rest, you use the hit dice. So you roll some dice, and based on the dice you roll, that's how much health you recover. In Baldur's Gate, they simplify that system and just says, when you take a short rest, you get half of your health back. They don't bother with those extra die rolls at all. And so, unlike Solasta, whose goal is to sort of capture and emulate the feel of playing D&D on tabletop, Baldur's Gate 3 embraces the fact that it's a video game, keeps the RNG in the background, and they emphasize the experience of the adventure, right? By only including the dice where it seems to matter the most, i.e. those dialogue options, those opportunities when a success or failure is like noticeably meaningful and can influence the course of the story. Baldur's Gate 3 really wants to emphasize the adventure. And Disco Elysium, kind of like Baldur's Gate 3, emphasizes the experience, right? But in this case, in Disco Elysium, the experience is getting the feel of the human brain and body and the subconscious, right? And sort of giving voice to all that, seeing all that work together in action, as well as, in terms of the actual role-playing part, like a sense of like self-discovery and understanding. And I liked how they did that with both the huge majority of invisible die rolls as representing your subconscious and just things happening in the background, and then the visible die rolls for when you're sort of making an effort to like do something different. So that's what I've got. These were, the main examples I'm familiar with of dice in video games. I'm sure there's more. Let me know what y'all think. about this or how other video games use dice, the designer brain in me would love to hear that. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. I hope that was fun. And as always, I will see y'all next time.